The American West of the 1870s and 1880s represented one of the most transformative periods in United States history. As the nation expanded westward following the Civil War, vast territories opened up for settlement, bringing with them both opportunity and chaos. This era, often romanticized in popular culture, was in reality a complex tapestry of economic ambition, cultural collision, and the struggle to establish order in lands that had previously known little formal governance. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 accelerated westward migration dramatically. Towns sprang up almost overnight along railroad lines and near mining operations, often growing faster than the institutions needed to maintain civil order. Into this vacuum stepped two types of men who would come to define the era: lawmen who sought to bring justice to wild territories, and outlaws who operated outside the bounds of established society. The relationship between these two groups was rarely simple. Many lawmen had questionable pasts themselves, while some outlaws operated according to their own codes of conduct that, while outside the law, nevertheless followed certain principles. It is within this morally complex landscape that our story takes place, a story that challenges our understanding of good and evil, law and justice, and the nature of honor itself. To understand the remarkable story of Jack Silver Malone and Marshal Elias Carter, we must first examine the world that created them. The Old West was not the simple battleground between heroes and villains that later mythology would suggest. Instead, it was a region in transition, where the institutions of Eastern civilization struggled to take root in an environment that resisted easy categorization. Law enforcement in the Western territories faced challenges unknown in the established states. Jurisdictions were vast and poorly defined. A sheriff might be responsible for a county covering thousands of square miles, with only a small deputy force to assist him. Federal marshals covered even larger territories, often working alone or with minimal support. Communication was slow, and backup could be days or weeks away when trouble erupted. The population of these frontier regions was diverse and transient. Prospectors seeking fortunes in gold and silver, cattle ranchers establishing vast spreads, farmers attempting to cultivate difficult land, merchants hoping to profit from the boom, and countless others seeking new beginnings, all mingled in communities that lacked the social structures of older settlements. Among them moved those who saw opportunity in lawlessness: bandits, claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, and confidence men. Economic factors played a significant role in frontier crime. The movement of gold, silver, and currency through remote areas created tempting targets. Banks in frontier towns often held substantial deposits with minimal security. Stagecoaches and trains carried payrolls and valuable shipments across lonely stretches where help was far away. The risk was high, but so was the potential reward for those willing to take it. The justice system itself was often informal and improvised. In many communities, the nearest circuit judge might visit only a few times a year. Jails were rudimentary when they existed at all. This created a situation where lawmen often had to make immediate decisions about guilt and punishment, sometimes leading to outcomes that would be considered inappropriate by modern standards, but were accepted as necessary by frontier communities. It was also an era when personal reputation carried tremendous weight. In a society where formal credentials and background checks were impossible, a man's word and his known history were his currency. This applied equally to lawmen and outlaws. A marshal known for fairness and courage could maintain order through respect rather than force. Similarly, an outlaw with a reputation for keeping his word might find cooperation and assistance that a more treacherous criminal would not. According to historical records and contemporary newspaper accounts, the man known as Jack Silver Malone was born Jacob Malone in Missouri around 1848, though exact details of his early life remain subject to debate among historians. What is known with greater certainty is that by his mid-20s, Malone had acquired a reputation as a skilled gunman and a man who operated outside the law. The origins of his nickname Silver have been attributed to various sources. Some accounts suggest it came from his preference for silver-adorned firearms and saddle equipment. Others claim it referred to his involvement in the theft of silver shipments from Nevada mining operations. Still, other sources indicate it was simply a reference to his eloquent speaking manner, a silver tongue that could talk his way out of difficult situations as effectively as his gun could shoot his way out. What distinguished Malone from many other outlaws of his era was his apparent code of conduct. Contemporary accounts, while acknowledging his criminal activities, often noted that he avoided unnecessary confrontation with ordinary citizens. His targets were typically businesses, particularly those associated with railroad and mining interests, institutions that many frontier residents viewed with suspicion as representatives of Eastern corporate power. Several documented incidents suggest a more complex character than the simple criminal label would indicate. In 1873, witnesses reported that Malone intervened to stop a stagecoach robbery being conducted by other outlaws, though he himself was wanted for similar crimes. In 1875, a Kansas newspaper reported that he had left money at a church to help a widow whose husband had been lost in a mining accident, though the circumstances of this act remain unclear. Malone's skills with firearms were frequently mentioned in period sources. He was described as exceptionally fast and accurate, attributes that kept him alive in an occupation with a notoriously high mortality rate. However, several accounts also emphasized his preference for avoiding confrontation when possible, suggesting a man who understood that survival often depended on intelligence rather than bravado. By the mid-1870s, Malone was wanted in at least 3 territories for various offenses related to robbery and theft. Reward notices described him as approximately 6 feet tall, lean in build, with dark hair, and what one notice termed eyes that miss nothing. He was known to associate with various criminal elements but was not permanently attached to any particular gang, preferring to work alone or with small, temporary partnerships. The reputation that preceded Malone was mixed. Law enforcement officials considered him a persistent problem, skilled enough to be dangerous, smart enough to be difficult to capture. Among certain frontier communities, however, particularly those resentful of corporate interests, he was sometimes viewed with a degree of grudging respect. He represented a kind of frontier independence, however illegal, that resonated with some who felt oppressed by outside forces. It is important to note that historical sources on Malone's activities must be viewed critically. Newspaper accounts from the era often exaggerated or sensationalized criminal activities to sell papers. Some stories attributed to Malone may have actually been the work of other outlaws, or may have been embellished significantly in the retelling. Nevertheless, enough consistent documentation exists to confirm his existence and his general pattern of activities during this period. In contrast to the shadowy and often contradictory accounts of Jack Malone's life, the historical record of Marshal Elias Carter is considerably more detailed and official. Born in Pennsylvania in 1842, Carter served with distinction in the Union Army during the Civil War, reaching the rank of sergeant, before being wounded at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. After recovering, he returned to service and completed his military obligation in 1865. Following the war, Carter moved west like many veterans, seeking opportunities in the expanding territories. He initially worked as a security officer for mining operations in Colorado, before being appointed as a deputy sheriff in a small but growing town. His performance in this role, marked by what contemporary accounts described as fairness combined with firm resolve, led to his appointment as a territorial marshal in 1871. As a federal marshal, Carter's jurisdiction was vast, covering regions that today would encompass significant portions of multiple states. His responsibilities included pursuing fugitives who crossed territorial lines, protecting federal interests such as mail delivery and land offices, and assisting local law enforcement when requested. It was a demanding position that required not only courage and competence, but also diplomatic skills in dealing with various local authorities and communities. Carter's reputation was built on several notable cases during his early career as a marshal. In 1872, he successfully tracked and apprehended a group responsible for multiple stagecoach robberies, doing so without loss of life despite the dangerous nature of the criminals involved. In 1874, he mediated a potentially explosive dispute between cattle ranchers and homesteaders that might otherwise have escalated into significant conflict. Those who worked with Carter described him as methodical and patient. Unlike some lawmen of the era who relied primarily on intimidation or quick action, Carter was known for careful investigation and a preference for bringing suspects in alive for proper trial. This approach was not based on any reluctance to use force when necessary. His military record and several documented confrontations demonstrated his courage under fire, but rather on a belief in proper legal process. Personal accounts from the period paint a picture of a man dedicated to his duty, but not without complexity. Carter was known to be a fair but firm enforcer of the law, unwilling to overlook criminal activity, but also unwilling to engage in the kind of harsh tactics that some frontier lawmen employed. He maintained correspondence with legal authorities in more established areas, keeping himself informed about proper procedures and legal developments. Carter's personal life was marked by loss. He had married shortly after the Civil War, but his wife passed away from illness in 1869, leaving him without children. Some historians have suggested that his intense dedication to his work as a marshal may have been partly driven by this personal tragedy, channeling his energy into public service in the absence of family obligations. By 1876, Carter had established himself as one of the more respected federal marshals in the Western Territories. His success rate in apprehending fugitives was notably high, and he had developed a network of contacts and informants that aided his investigations. He was known for keeping detailed records of criminal activities and patterns, an unusual practice for the time, but one that contributed to his effectiveness. The marshal's approach to his work reflected a broader philosophy about law and civilization. In several preserved letters to federal authorities, Carter expressed his belief that the establishment of reliable justice was essential to the development of the Western Territories. He saw his role not merely as catching criminals, but as helping to build the foundation for stable communities, where the rule of law would eventually replace frontier chaos. By early 1877, both Jack Malone and Marshal Elias Carter were well-established figures in their respective roles, one as a wanted outlaw with a growing reputation, the other as a federal marshal known for his dedication and effectiveness. Historical evidence suggests that Carter had been tracking Malone's activities for several months, piecing together reports from various sources to understand the outlaw's patterns and likely locations. The region where their paths would intersect was particularly volatile during this period. The discovery of silver deposits had brought a rush of prospectors and supporting businesses, creating several rapidly growing towns with all the attendant problems of boom communities. Competition for claims, disputes over water and land rights, and the usual criminal elements attracted to wealth and weak governance created a powder keg situation. Adding to the instability was the presence of organized criminal groups that operated beyond the individual outlaw or small gang level. These groups, sometimes referred to as regulator companies or mercenary bands, offered protection services that often amounted to extortion, involved themselves in claim disputes on behalf of paying clients, and occasionally engaged in outright seizure of property and resources. They represented a more systematic threat to order than individual criminals like Malone. Carter had been investigating reports of one such group operating in the territory under his jurisdiction. Led by a former Confederate officer named Thomas Bridger, this band had been implicated in several suspicious incidents, where property had changed hands following intimidation or worse. However, proving criminal activity and building a case that would stand up in court was proving difficult, as witnesses were understandably reluctant to testify against armed and dangerous men. Malone's activities during this same period, based on available records, suggest he was planning what newspapers would later describe as an ambitious robbery, targeting a large silver shipment. The exact details of his intentions remain unclear, but correspondence between law enforcement officials indicates that multiple agencies were aware that something significant was being planned, though they lacked specific information about timing or location. The social dynamics of the frontier communities in this region created an environment where the lines between law and lawlessness were often blurred in practice, even as they remained distinct in theory. Many residents harbored resentment toward Eastern business interests that they felt were exploiting local resources. Some viewed outlaws like Malone as, if not heroes, at least representatives of a kind of frontier independence against corporate power. At the same time, the desire for stable communities where businesses could operate and families could settle safely meant that most residents ultimately supported proper law enforcement. Marshal Carter understood these complex community attitudes. His correspondence from this period shows an awareness that effective law enforcement required not just catching criminals, but building trust with communities that were often suspicious of outside authority. He sought to demonstrate that federal law represented justice and fairness, not merely the interests of distant powers. The stage was thus set for an encounter between two men who represented opposing sides of frontier society, one who enforced the law, one who defied it. What neither could have anticipated was that circumstances would force them into a situation where their mutual survival would depend on cooperation, and where that cooperation would challenge both their assumptions and their reputations. Historical analysis of this period suggests that both men were, in their different ways, products of their time and environment. Carter represented the forward movement of civilization and institutional order into the Western territories. Malone represented the resistance to that order, whether from genuine ideological opposition, personal gain, or simply the lack of opportunities that would have allowed him to succeed within the legal framework. To understand the remarkable events that would unfold, we must examine a crucial aspect of Old West culture that often receives insufficient attention: the unwritten codes of conduct that governed behavior even among those who lived outside the formal law. These codes were not universal and were not always observed, but they existed as a kind of parallel moral framework that influenced decisions and actions in ways that shaped frontier history. Among lawmen, a code existed that emphasized courage, fairness, and protection of the community. A good lawman was expected to face danger personally rather than sending others into harm's way. He was expected to treat prisoners humanely and ensure they received proper trials. He was expected to be incorruptible, refusing bribes or special favors. While not all lawmen lived up to these ideals, they represented the standard by which marshals and sheriffs were judged by their communities. Among outlaws and gunfighters, a different but related code operated. Respect for worthy opponents, keeping one's word even when given to enemies, and avoiding harm to those not involved in conflicts were principles that some, though certainly not all, criminals followed. There was often an expectation that confrontations would be face-to-face rather than from ambush, that women and children would not be targeted, and that certain locations such as churches would be respected as neutral ground. These codes were not legal standards, and violating them carried no official penalty. However, reputation was crucial in frontier society, and a man known to have acted dishonorably might find himself shunned, without allies, and vulnerable to retaliation. Even among criminals, there were gradations of respectability, and those who violated fundamental principles of frontier honor often found themselves targeted by both law enforcement and other outlaws. The concept of a fair fight was particularly important in this cultural framework. While the reality often fell short of the ideal, there was a widespread expectation that confrontations between armed men should involve some element of mutual risk and opportunity. Shooting an unarmed man or attacking from concealment was considered cowardly, while facing an opponent directly carried honor regardless of the outcome. This cultural context helps explain why certain actions that might seem contradictory, such as an outlaw saving a lawman, could occur and be understood by contemporary observers. Such an action might be seen not as betraying one's outlaw status, but as adhering to a deeper principle of honor that transcended the immediate law versus lawless divide. Religious and philosophical beliefs also played a role in shaping frontier ethics. Many frontier residents, whether lawmen, outlaws, or ordinary citizens, had been raised in Christian traditions that emphasized concepts of redemption, forgiveness, and moral duty. While their actions might not always reflect these teachings, the cultural influence remained present, creating internal tensions that sometimes led to surprising choices. The concept of personal debt was also significant. If one man saved another's life, this created an obligation that was taken seriously. Such debts crossed social boundaries and could influence decisions in ways that defied simple logic. A man might feel obligated to repay a life debt even to someone who was otherwise his enemy, and failure to acknowledge such a debt could damage one's reputation severely. Marshal Carter and Jack Malone, despite standing on opposite sides of the law, were both men shaped by these frontier codes. Their actions were influenced not only by legal obligations or criminal enterprises, but by these deeper cultural expectations about honor, courage, and proper conduct. Understanding this context is essential to comprehending how their unlikely alliance could form and what it meant to those who witnessed it. In the American West of the 1870s, where formal documentation was limited and information traveled slowly, personal reputation functioned as a form of social currency with real practical consequences. This was true across all levels of society, but particularly crucial for lawmen and outlaws, whose effectiveness often depended on what others believed about them. For Marshal Carter, his reputation as a fair but determined lawman preceded him into new communities and situations. When he arrived in a town investigating a case, his known history meant that local authorities and citizens had expectations about how he would conduct himself. His reputation made some criminals more likely to surrender peacefully rather than resist, knowing that he would ensure proper treatment and a fair trial. It also made some witnesses more willing to provide information, trusting that he would use it appropriately. However, reputation could also be a burden. Carter was known to keep his word, which meant that any promise or statement he made carried weight. He could not make empty threats or false offers of leniency without destroying the credibility that made his work possible. His reputation for bringing in prisoners alive rather than in coffins meant that he was expected to take greater personal risks to achieve this outcome, even when a more aggressive approach might be easier. For Malone, reputation served different but equally important functions. His known skills and courage meant that other criminals might seek him out for partnerships or might avoid interfering with his activities. His reputation for having certain principles, avoiding unnecessary harm to bystanders, keeping agreements with accomplices, meant that he could find cooperation and assistance in communities that would not support more ruthless criminals. At the same time, Malone's reputation as a wanted outlaw with a price on his head meant that he could never fully trust anyone and had to constantly guard against betrayal. His reputation as a skilled gunman meant that anyone seeking to make a name for themselves might see him as a target, forcing him to remain constantly vigilant. Some lawmen, eager to enhance their own reputations, might focus on capturing him specifically because of his notoriety. The role of newspapers in shaping and spreading reputations cannot be overlooked. Frontier newspapers, hungry for dramatic stories to attract readers, regularly reported on the activities of notable lawmen and outlaws, often embellishing facts or even inventing details when the truth was insufficiently exciting. These accounts spread rapidly as newspapers were shared, reprinted, and discussed, creating regional and sometimes national awareness of particular individuals. Both Carter and Malone had been subjects of newspaper coverage. Carter praised for his successful investigations and apprehensions. Malone described in terms ranging from dangerous criminal to gentleman bandit, depending on the newspaper's perspective and the specific incident being reported. Neither man had full control over how they were portrayed, yet these portrayals shaped how others responded to them. The concept of living up to one's reputation created psychological pressures as well. Once a man was known for certain qualities, courage, honesty, skill, there was an expectation that he would continue to demonstrate these characteristics. Failure to do so could result in loss of respect and effectiveness. This meant that both lawmen and outlaws sometimes found themselves taking actions primarily to maintain their reputations rather than for practical reasons. In the case of Carter and Malone, their reputations would prove to be both an asset and a complication in the events to come. Carter's reputation for integrity would be tested when circumstances forced him into cooperation with a known criminal. Malone's reputation as an outlaw with principles would be challenged by the choice to assist a federal marshal. How they navigated these challenges while maintaining their essential identities would become part of the legend that followed. As we conclude this first chapter, we have established the historical and cultural context necessary to understand the remarkable events that would unfold. The American frontier of the 1870s was a place of contradictions, lawless, yet governed by unwritten codes, violent yet bound by concepts of honor, chaotic yet moving inexorably toward civilization and order. Marshal Elias Carter represented the institutional forces seeking to bring stable governance to the Western territories. His career demonstrated that effective law enforcement required not only courage and competence, but also fairness and respect for proper legal processes. He was a man committed to building a foundation for civilized society in regions that had known little formal government. Jack Silver Malone represented the resistance to that institutional order, whether from principle or profit. His career demonstrated that even those operating outside the law might follow their own codes and might possess qualities that complicated simple moral judgments. He was a man who had chosen to live by his own rules in defiance of society's demands. Both men were products of their time and environment, shaped by the Civil War, the westward expansion, and the particular conditions of frontier life. Both had established reputations that preceded them and influenced how others responded to their presence. Both operated according to principles that, while different, emphasized courage, competence, and certain standards of conduct. The historical stage was set for their paths to cross in a manner that neither anticipated. The volatile conditions in the territory they both operated within, the presence of organized criminal threats beyond individual outlaws, and the complex social dynamics of frontier communities created an environment where conventional expectations could be overturned and where survival might require unlikely alliances. In the chapters that follow, we will examine the specific events that brought these two men together, the challenges they faced, and the legacy of their unexpected cooperation. We will explore how a single moment of decision, when an outlaw chose to save a lawman's life, set in motion a chain of events that would become legend, inspiring stories and speculation that continue to this day. The story of Jack Silver Malone and Marshal Elias Carter challenges our understanding of the Old West and the people who lived in it. It reminds us that history is rarely as simple as legends suggest, that individuals are more complex than their labels indicate, and that circumstances can create outcomes that defy prediction. It is a story grounded in the realities of frontier life, while illustrating the timeless themes of honor, redemption, and the unexpected connections that can form between seeming opposites. As we move forward, we will maintain our focus on the historical record while acknowledging the limitations of that record. We will separate documented facts from probable embellishments while recognizing that even legends contain truths about the values and concerns of those who created them. The legend of the outlaw who saved the marshal's life reflects something important about how frontier Americans understood courage, honor, and the possibility of redemption, themes that continue to resonate in American culture today. The events of March 15, 1877, would become one of the most discussed incidents in the history of the American frontier. On that day, in a remote canyon approximately 20 miles from the mining town of Silver Creek, an encounter occurred that would challenge conventional understanding of law and lawlessness, duty and honor, and the nature of human character itself. Historical documentation of this incident comes from multiple sources: official reports filed by Marshal Elias Carter, witness statements collected in subsequent investigations, newspaper accounts published in the following weeks, and later recollections from individuals who had knowledge of the events. While these sources sometimes differ in details, they agree on the essential facts of what transpired and why it mattered. To understand this pivotal moment, we must examine not only what happened, but also the circumstances that led both men to that particular place at that particular time. We must consider the larger context of criminal activity in the region, the motivations of all parties involved, and the split-second decisions that determined outcomes. Most importantly, we must understand how this incident revealed character traits that would reshape both men's futures and create a legend that would outlive them both. The story of the ambush is ultimately a story about choices made under extreme pressure, choices that could have easily gone differently but, because of who these men were, unfolded in a manner that contemporaries found remarkable enough to preserve and retell. It is a reminder that history pivots on individual decisions made in moments when there is no time for careful deliberation, only instinct shaped by character and principle. In the weeks leading up to March 15th, both Marshal Carter and Jack Malone were operating in the same general region, though for very different purposes. Understanding their activities during this period helps explain how they came to be in the same location on that fateful day. Marshal Carter had been investigating reports of escalating criminal activity attributed to the Bridger Gang, a group of approximately 12 to 15 men led by Thomas Bridger. Intelligence gathered from various sources suggested that this group was planning something significant, though the exact nature of their plans remained unclear. Carter had been methodically interviewing witnesses, examining patterns of behavior, and attempting to anticipate where the gang might strike next. Carter's investigation was complicated by the reluctance of potential witnesses to provide information. The Bridger gang had established a reputation for retaliation against those who cooperated with law enforcement. Several individuals who might have had useful information declined to speak with Carter, and others provided only vague or unhelpful details. This was a common challenge in frontier law enforcement, where the protection that legal institutions could offer was often uncertain and distant. Despite these obstacles, Carter had made progress. Through careful analysis of reported sightings and activities, he had determined that the Bridger gang was likely operating from a base somewhere in the mountainous region north of Silver Creek. He had also learned that the gang had been making inquiries about shipment schedules for the local mining operations, suggesting they were planning to intercept a valuable transport. Carter's approach to this investigation reflected his characteristic patience and thoroughness. Rather than rushing in with insufficient information, he was building a comprehensive understanding of his adversaries, their numbers, their likely locations, their patterns of behavior, and their probable next moves. His goal was not merely to disrupt one criminal operation, but to dismantle the entire organization and bring its members to justice. Meanwhile, Jack Malone's activities during this same period were also connected to the Silver Creek region, though historical sources disagree about his exact intentions. Some accounts suggest he was indeed planning to rob a silver shipment, as law enforcement officials suspected. Other sources indicate he was actually investigating the Bridger gang himself, having heard reports that they were attempting to muscle in on territory he considered his own operational area. A third interpretation, suggested by some historians analyzing the available evidence, is that Malone had learned something about the Bridger gang's activities that concerned him for reasons beyond mere professional rivalry. Some contemporary accounts hint that the Bridger gang's methods were particularly harsh, including intimidation of ordinary citizens and mistreatment of those who resisted their demands, activities that violated the unwritten codes that some outlaws, including possibly Malone, tried to observe. What is documented with greater certainty is that Malone was in the region during early March 1877 and was gathering information about various activities in the area. He was reportedly staying at a small ranch outside Silver Creek, paying for his lodging and keeping a low profile. Several witnesses later reported seeing him in town on multiple occasions, making inquiries and observing the comings and goings at the mining company offices and the bank. The convergence of these two men, the marshal investigating a criminal gang and the outlaw operating in the same region, created a situation ripe with potential for confrontation. Both were aware, at least in general terms, of the other's presence in the area. Carter knew that Malone was wanted and was somewhere in the territory he patrolled. Malone knew that a federal marshal was actively investigating criminal activity in the region where he was operating. Yet, on the morning of March 15th, neither man was specifically seeking the other. Carter was following a lead that suggested the Bridger gang might be camped in or near Devil's Canyon, a remote area with difficult terrain that would provide good cover for a group seeking to avoid detection. Malone, for reasons that remain debated by historians, was also heading toward the same general area, possibly trailing the same gang or possibly seeking to scout the terrain for his own purposes. Devil's Canyon, the location where the crucial events would unfold, was a geographic feature well known to locals but treacherous to those unfamiliar with its characteristics. Understanding this landscape is essential to comprehending what happened and why the situation developed as it did. The canyon was approximately 3 miles long, with steep walls rising several hundred feet on both sides. A seasonal stream ran through the canyon floor, and the route through the canyon was one of only a few practical passages through that section of the mountain range. This made it both a convenient route for travelers and a potentially dangerous bottleneck where ambushes could be executed with devastating effectiveness. The canyon's name reflected its reputation. Local settlers and travelers regarded it as a hazardous passage, not only because of its geography, but also because of several incidents over the years in which travelers had been robbed or attacked there. The walls provided numerous positions from which attackers could fire down on anyone passing through. while those on the canyon floor had limited cover and few options for escape. The vegetation in the canyon consisted primarily of scrub brush and scattered juniper trees, providing minimal concealment for anyone traveling through. Large boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls over centuries created some obstacles and potential cover points, but the overall terrain favored those holding the high ground over those on the canyon floor. Marshal Carter was aware of the canyon's reputation, but judged that the intelligence he had received warranted the risk of approaching through it. His information suggested that the Bridger gang might be using the area beyond the canyon as a base of operations, and the canyon route was the most direct approach. Carter was traveling alone, as was often necessary for marshals covering vast territories with limited deputy assistance. His plan was to conduct reconnaissance, gathering information that could be used to organize a larger operation to apprehend the gang. The decision to travel alone through potentially dangerous territory might seem reckless by modern standards, but it was consistent with the realities of frontier law enforcement. Marshals often had to operate independently, and waiting for backup or organizing large posses took time that might allow criminals to escape or continue their activities. Carter's experience and skills had kept him alive through numerous dangerous situations, and he had reason to believe he could pass through the canyon without incident if he remained alert and cautious. What Carter could not have known was that the Bridger gang had indeed been using the area and had posted lookouts who spotted his approach. Recognizing him as a federal marshal, his reputation and appearance were known to criminals operating in the region. They saw an opportunity to eliminate a significant threat to their operations. Rather than fleeing, they prepared an ambush. According to Carter's later official report and supporting witness testimony, the marshal entered Devil's Canyon at approximately mid-morning on March 15th. The weather was clear and visibility was good, conditions that seemed favorable for safe passage but which also meant that lookouts could easily spot his approach from considerable distance. Carter was riding carefully, aware of the canyon's reputation and the potential for danger. He kept his horse to a steady walk, scanning the canyon walls and the terrain ahead for any signs of threat. His hand remained near his sidearm, and he had his rifle ready in its saddle holster. These were standard precautions for any experienced lawman traveling through uncertain territory. The ambush was triggered when Carter was approximately 1/3 of the way through the canyon, at a point where the walls narrowed somewhat, and large boulders created a more confined passage. The initial shots came from multiple positions on both canyon walls, a coordinated attack by experienced shooters positioned to create a deadly crossfire. Carter's horse was struck in the first volley and went down immediately, throwing the marshal from the saddle. This was likely intentional on the part of the ambushers. Disabling the horse eliminated Carter's ability to escape quickly and left him exposed on the canyon floor. Carter managed to maintain his grip on his rifle during the fall and immediately sought cover behind his fallen horse and nearby rocks. The official report describes the situation Carter faced as extremely dangerous. He was outnumbered by attackers holding superior positions, with limited cover and no immediate possibility of escape. His horse was down, providing some protection but also pinning him in position. The attackers had clear lines of fire from multiple angles, and Carter's defensive position was sustainable only in the short term. Despite these overwhelming disadvantages, Carter returned fire with disciplined accuracy. His military training and experience as a lawman had prepared him for combat situations, and he did not panic, despite the desperate circumstances. Several witnesses later testified that they heard sustained gunfire from the canyon for several minutes, suggesting that Carter was actively defending his position and forcing his attackers to maintain their distance rather than closing in immediately. However, the tactical situation was unsustainable. Carter was conserving ammunition, knowing that once he exhausted his supply, he would be helpless. The attackers were in no hurry, able to maintain their siege while remaining relatively safe from return fire. Time was entirely on their side, and both Carter and his attackers knew it. It was at this critical moment, with the marshal's situation deteriorating and his options running out, that Jack Malone arrived at the canyon. Jack Malone's arrival at Devil's Canyon at precisely this moment has been the subject of much historical speculation. Some accounts suggest it was pure chance, that Malone happened to be traveling the same route for his own purposes and stumbled upon the ambush in progress. Other interpretations propose that Malone had been tracking either the Marshal or the Bridger gang and arrived intentionally, though for reasons that remain unclear. What is documented is that Malone approached the canyon from the opposite end from which Carter had entered. He heard the gunfire before coming into view of the ambush site and immediately recognized the tactical situation. Shots being fired from elevated positions on the canyon walls, with return fire coming from the canyon floor. His experience told him that someone was trapped in an ambush, though he did not initially know who. Malone's first action was to position himself carefully where he could observe without being detected. From his vantage point, he could see several of the ambushers on the canyon walls and could identify them as members of the Bridger gang based on their appearance and behavior. He could also see the person they were attacking, Marshal Elias Carter, pinned down behind his fallen horse. This presented Malone with a choice that would define the rest of his life. The logical course of action from a purely self-interested perspective would have been to withdraw quietly and avoid involvement. The ambushers were not targeting him, and intervening would accomplish nothing positive for his own situation, while potentially putting him in danger. Additionally, the person being attacked was a federal marshal actively seeking to apprehend outlaws like himself. Allowing the ambush to succeed would eliminate someone whose job was to hunt him. Yet Malone made a different choice. According to his own later account, given to a newspaper correspondent who interviewed him years after these events, several factors influenced his decision. First, he recognized the ambushers as members of the Bridger gang, a group he regarded as operating without honor or principle. Second, he had developed a degree of respect for Marshal Carter through reputation, viewing him as a lawman who, despite being an adversary, conducted himself with integrity. Third, the nature of the ambush itself, multiple attackers shooting from cover at a lone man with no chance to defend himself fairly, violated Malone's sense of how conflicts should be conducted. Most significantly, Malone later stated that he believed the ambushers intended not merely to stop Carter, but to ensure he did not survive, eliminating a persistent threat to their operations. This intention toward what Malone termed murder, rather than a fair fight, appears to have been the decisive factor in his choice to intervene. Malone's intervention demonstrated both his tactical skills and his deep understanding of combat situations. Rather than simply opening fire from his position, which might have been ineffective and would have immediately exposed him to return fire from multiple opponents, he took time to assess the situation and develop a plan. The ambushers were focused entirely on Carter, confident in their tactical superiority and anticipating his inevitable surrender or defeat. They were not watching for threats from other directions, having positioned lookouts only to detect approach from the directions they expected. This overconfidence created a vulnerability that Malone could exploit. Malone positioned himself to engage the ambushers on one side of the canyon wall, where he could target several of them before they could effectively respond. His plan was to create enough confusion and threat that the ambushers would have to divide their attention between Carter and this new attacker, potentially giving the marshal an opportunity to improve his position or escape. When Malone opened fire, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Two of the ambushers were struck in the first shots, not fatally but seriously enough to put them out of the fight. The others immediately scrambled for cover, uncertain how many attackers they now faced or where additional shots might come from. The coordinated ambush suddenly became a chaotic situation with threats from multiple directions. Marshal Carter, recognizing immediately that someone was shooting at his attackers rather than at him, took advantage of the confusion to improve his defensive position. He moved quickly to better cover behind a large boulder, gaining a position from which he could more effectively return fire. The combination of Carter's disciplined defense and Malone's unexpected attack transformed the tactical situation dramatically. The Bridger gang members found themselves in an untenable position. They were now under fire from two directions. They had already taken casualties, and they could not determine how many opponents they actually faced. Their leader, Thomas Bridger, made the decision to withdraw rather than continue an engagement that had gone from certain victory to uncertain outcome. The gang members retreated from their positions and fled deeper into the mountains. The entire engagement, from Malone's first shot to the gang's retreat, lasted perhaps 5 minutes. In that brief span, the situation had completely reversed, and Marshal Carter had gone from facing almost certain defeat to being saved by the intervention of one of the very outlaws he was sworn to apprehend. With the immediate danger past, Marshal Carter and Jack Malone found themselves facing each other across the canyon floor. Both men kept their weapons ready, uncertain how this unexpected encounter would resolve. The tension of the moment was captured in several later accounts. Two men on opposite sides of the law, one having just saved the other's life, neither quite sure what should happen next. Carter was the first to speak, according to multiple accounts. He acknowledged that Malone had saved his life and thanked him for the intervention. This courtesy, despite the complicated situation, reflected Carter's character and his understanding of the debt he now owed. However, he also made clear that his obligation as a marshal had not changed. Malone was still a wanted man, and Carter still had a duty to enforce the law. Malone's response, as reported in various sources, was pragmatic. He acknowledged Carter's position, but pointed out the practical reality of their situation. Both men were now in danger from the Bridger gang, which would certainly seek revenge for the failed ambush and the casualties they had suffered. Malone suggested that immediate self-preservation took precedence over their official adversarial relationship. What followed was a conversation that several historians have described as remarkable for its directness and mutual respect, despite the complicated circumstances. Both men recognized that they faced a common threat that superseded their individual conflict. The Bridger gang was now aware that both Carter and Malone had interfered with their operations and would seek to eliminate both of them. Separately, each man would be vulnerable. Together, they might be able to defend themselves and potentially turn the situation to their advantage. Carter faced a profound dilemma. His duty as a marshal required him to arrest Malone, yet he owed his life to this same man, a debt that frontier honor codes regarded as sacred. Additionally, the practical reality was that he needed assistance to deal with the larger threat that the Bridger gang represented. His horse was gone, he was far from any support, and he was in territory where the gang could easily ambush him again if he traveled alone. Malone faced a different but equally significant choice. He could simply leave, putting distance between himself and both Carter and the Bridger gang. However, the Bridger gang now regarded him as an enemy and would pursue him. Additionally, having revealed his presence and his willingness to oppose the gang, he had in some sense committed himself to seeing the situation through. Walking away might mean constantly looking over his shoulder for retaliation. The decision they reached represented a pragmatic compromise between duty, honor, and survival. They would form a temporary alliance to deal with the Bridger gang threat. During this time, Carter would not attempt to arrest Malone, and Malone would not attempt to flee or obstruct Carter's broader law enforcement activities. Once the immediate threat was resolved, they would part ways and return to their respective roles. Marshal and Outlaw, each doing what he had to do. This agreement was formalized with a handshake, a gesture that carried significant weight in frontier culture. Both men were known for keeping their word, and both understood that breaking this agreement would damage their reputations beyond repair. The handshake created a temporary suspension of their normal relationship, a recognition that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses. Word of the ambush and Malone's intervention spread quickly through the frontier communities. Within days, multiple versions of the story were circulating, each adding or embellishing details. Newspapers picked up the story, and within weeks accounts had appeared in publications throughout the Western territories and even in some eastern cities. The reactions to the news were mixed and reflected the complex attitudes toward law and lawlessness that characterized frontier society. Some praised Malone's intervention as an act of courage and honor, evidence that even outlaws could possess redeeming qualities. Others viewed it with suspicion, wondering what Malone's true motives might have been, or what arrangement he might have made with the marshal. Law enforcement officials had particularly complicated reactions. Some felt that Carter should have immediately arrested Malone despite the circumstances, viewing the temporary alliance as an inappropriate compromise of duty. Others recognized the practical realities Carter faced and supported his decision as the best available option in difficult circumstances. Several official communications from this period show ongoing debate about how Carter's actions should be evaluated. Among criminal elements, the news also generated significant discussion. Some outlaws viewed Malone's decision to assist a marshal as a betrayal of outlaw solidarity. Others saw it as consistent with the code of honor that some criminals tried to observe. particularly given the reputation of the Bridger Gang for operating without principle. The incident contributed to Malone's already complex reputation, adding another layer to how he was perceived. The citizens of communities in the region had perhaps the most favorable view of the incident. Many residents were concerned about the Bridger Gang's activities and welcomed anything that might lead to the gang being stopped. The idea of a marshal and an outlaw joining forces against a common enemy appealed to the frontier's sense of practicality and rough justice. It suggested that when truly dangerous criminals threatened a community, even unlikely allies might cooperate for the greater good. Religious leaders and newspaper editors debated the moral and ethical implications of the alliance. Some saw it as an example of redemption, with Malone's good act potentially representing the beginning of a path back to lawful behavior. Others viewed it as a troubling compromise with criminality, warning that respect for law must be absolute, and that exceptions, however sympathetically motivated, undermined social order. The incident also raised questions about the nature of honor and duty. If an outlaw performs an honorable act, does that change his status or obligations? If a lawman owes his life to a criminal, does that debt override his duty to enforce the law? These were not abstract philosophical questions for frontier residents, but practical dilemmas that touched on deeply held values about loyalty, obligation, and justice. To fully understand why both contemporaries and later historians found this incident so significant, we must examine the frontier concepts of honor and proper conduct that gave it meaning. The Old West, despite its reputation for lawlessness, actually had elaborate informal codes governing behavior, particularly among those involved in violence either legally or illegally. The concept of a fair fight was central to these codes. While the reality often fell short of the ideal, there was widespread agreement that confrontations should involve mutual awareness and opportunity to defend oneself. Ambushes like the one Carter faced were technically effective, but were regarded as dishonorable by many, even by some outlaws. This helps explain why Malone, despite being an outlaw himself, might have been offended by the manner in which the Bridger Gang attacked Carter. The obligation to repay debts, particularly life debts, was another crucial element of frontier honor codes. Saving someone's life created a bond that was taken seriously across social boundaries. This was true in various frontier contexts, between different ethnic groups, between enemies in conflict, and certainly between law enforcement and outlaws. Carter's acknowledgement of his debt to Malone was not merely polite courtesy, but recognition of an obligation that his community would expect him to honor. Respect for worthy opponents was also part of this code. A lawman who had proven himself brave and fair like Carter earned respect even from those he pursued. An outlaw who had demonstrated skill and adherence to certain principles, like Malone, similarly earned a degree of respect from lawmen who opposed him. This mutual respect did not eliminate their adversarial relationship, but created a foundation for certain types of interaction, including the temporary alliance they formed. The concept of keeping one's word was perhaps the most fundamental element of all frontier honor codes. In a society where formal contracts were often impossible or impractical, where legal enforcement was uncertain, and where trust was essential for cooperation, a man's word was his most valuable possession. Both Carter and Malone had reputations for keeping their commitments, which made their agreement credible to others and binding to themselves. These codes existed alongside and sometimes in tension with formal law and religious teachings. They represented a practical moral framework for a society in transition, providing guidelines for conduct in situations where official institutions were weak or absent. They were not perfect, they were not always observed, and they sometimes produced outcomes that would be considered problematic by modern standards. Nevertheless, they served important functions in maintaining some degree of order and predictability in a chaotic environment. The alliance between Carter and Malone worked precisely because both men operated according to these codes. Each trusted the other to honor their agreement, because both had reputations for keeping their word. Each understood the obligations created by Carter's life debt to Malone. Each recognized that their temporary cooperation did not negate their fundamental relationship. Marshal and Outlaw would eventually return to their respective roles. But for now, circumstances required a different interaction. The tactical elements of the Devil's Canyon ambush and Malone's counter-intervention provide insight into the nature of frontier combat and the skills required for survival in that environment. Understanding these aspects helps us appreciate both the danger Carter faced and the competence that Malone demonstrated. Ambushes were among the most effective and feared tactics in frontier conflicts. The advantages of surprise, superior position, and the ability to choose when and where to initiate combat made well-executed ambushes extremely difficult to defend against. The Bridger Gang's choice of Devil's Canyon demonstrated understanding of tactical principles. The confined space limited the target's options for escape, the high walls provided protected firing positions, and the distance made accurate return fire difficult. However, ambushes also had vulnerabilities. They required coordination among multiple attackers, clear lines of sight and fire, and usually the assumption that no external interference would occur. The ambushers needed to maintain discipline, following a plan rather than acting impulsively. They also needed lookouts to prevent being surprised themselves, a requirement that the Bridger Gang apparently failed to adequately address, allowing Malone to approach undetected. Marshal Carter's defensive response demonstrated the training and experience that kept frontier lawmen alive. His immediate reaction to take cover, his disciplined return fire to keep attackers at distance, and his conservation of ammunition showed tactical awareness. He did not panic despite overwhelming disadvantage, but instead worked to prolong the engagement while looking for any opportunity to improve his situation. When Malone's intervention created such an opportunity, Carter immediately recognized and exploited it. Malone's counter-ambush showed similar high-level tactical competence. Rather than rushing in impulsively, he took time to assess the situation and identify vulnerabilities in the ambusher's positions. His choice of firing position gave him advantage while minimizing his own exposure. His initial shots targeted key ambushers, maximizing the disruption to their coordination. The entire action demonstrated the skills that had kept him alive and successful in his dangerous profession. The rapid reversal of the tactical situation, from Carter facing almost certain defeat to the Bridger Gang fleeing, illustrates how quickly frontier confrontations could change. The introduction of even one additional capable combatant could dramatically alter the balance of forces. The psychological impact of being attacked from an unexpected direction, combined with immediate casualties, broke the ambusher's confidence and made continued engagement seem too risky. These tactical realities shaped frontier life in important ways. Individuals had to develop high levels of situational awareness and combat competence to survive. The ability to read terrain, anticipate threats, and respond effectively to violent situations was not optional for those operating in dangerous roles, whether as lawmen or outlaws. This created a kind of natural selection where those who lacked these skills did not survive long, while those who mastered them established reputations based on demonstrated competence. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Devil's Canyon incident was not the tactical elements but the psychological dynamics that emerged between Carter and Malone. The ability of two adversaries to form a functioning alliance, even temporarily, required a type of trust that might seem impossible given their opposed positions. This trust was built on several foundations. First, both men had established reputations that preceded them. Carter was known as a lawman who kept his word and treated even criminals with a degree of fairness. Malone was known as an outlaw who, despite his illegal activities, adhered to certain principles and honored his commitments. These reputations provided a basis for each to believe that the other would honor their agreement. Second, the immediate danger from the Bridger Gang created a powerful shared interest that overrode their normal adversarial relationship. Both men recognized that they faced a lethal threat that neither could effectively counter alone. This shared vulnerability created a practical motivation for cooperation that transcended their official roles. Third, the life debt that Carter owed to Malone created a personal bond that complicated their official relationship. Frontier culture took such debts seriously, and both men understood that this obligation existed regardless of their legal positions. Carter could not honorably arrest the man who had just saved his life, at least not immediately, without violating a fundamental principle of frontier honor. Fourth, both men appear to have possessed a degree of psychological sophistication that allowed them to maintain multiple perspectives simultaneously. They could recognize each other as adversaries in one context while being allies in another. They could acknowledge the validity of competing obligations, Carter's duty as a lawman and his debt as a man whose life had been saved, without requiring that one completely override the other. The conversation they had after the ambush, by multiple accounts, was notable for its directness and lack of pretense. Neither man attempted to deny the complexity of their situation or the inherent tension in their temporary alliance. They acknowledged these difficulties explicitly and agreed to manage them through clear communication and mutual commitment to their agreement. This pragmatic approach reflected the frontier tendency to address problems directly rather than through elaborate social maneuvering. Psychological research on trust suggests that it is built through demonstrated reliability over time. In the case of Carter and Malone, their reputations provided a form of demonstrated reliability. Each had a history of keeping commitments and acting according to stated principles. The crisis situation accelerated the normal process of building trust, requiring them to make immediate judgments about each other's trustworthiness based on reputation and immediate observation rather than extended interaction. The ambush at Devil's Canyon on March 15, 1877, lasted only minutes but created consequences that would extend for years. In that brief, violent encounter, the expected course of events for both Marshal Elias Carter and Jack Silver Malone was fundamentally altered. Carter had expected that his pursuit of the Bridger gang would follow the pattern of his previous investigations: patient gathering of intelligence, careful planning, and eventual apprehension of the criminals through a combination of skill and legal authority. The ambush showed him the limits of working alone, and the reality that his reputation and competence were not always sufficient protection against determined opponents with tactical advantages. More significantly, the ambush and Malone's intervention placed Carter in a position he had never anticipated, owing his life to an outlaw he was sworn to apprehend. This created a moral and practical dilemma that could not be easily resolved through reference to official regulations or legal precedent. He had to navigate competing obligations of duty and honor, legality and personal debt, in a situation where no clear guidelines existed. For Malone, the decision to intervene represented a choice that he might easily have avoided. Self-interest suggested staying hidden and allowing events to unfold without his involvement. Yet something in his character, whether genuine moral principle, respect for an honorable opponent, or simply revulsion at the dishonorable nature of the ambush, led him to act. That choice put him in direct conflict with the Bridger gang and created an alliance with a federal marshal that few would have predicted. The incident also revealed important truths about both men's characters. Carter demonstrated courage and competence under extreme pressure, refusing to panic even when facing overwhelming odds. Malone demonstrated that his reputation for having principles was genuine, that he would act according to those principles, even when doing so offered him no obvious benefit, and potentially created additional problems for him. Most significantly, the ambush created a bond between the two men that transcended their official roles. They had shared combat, had protected each other under fire, and had formed an agreement based on mutual respect and practical necessity. This bond would shape their subsequent actions and ultimately create the legend that would outlive them both. The news of the ambush and its unexpected outcome spread quickly through frontier communities, generating discussion and debate that reflected the complex moral landscape of the Old West. People recognized that something significant had occurred, though they disagreed about its meaning and implications. The story touched on fundamental questions about duty and honor, justice and mercy, the nature of criminality, and the possibility of redemption. As we move forward to examine what happened next, we must keep in mind the psychological and moral complexities that the Devil's Canyon ambush revealed. The alliance between Carter and Malone was not a simple partnership of convenience, but a relationship built on mutual respect, shared danger, and the recognition that circumstances sometimes require individuals to act outside the usual boundaries of their social roles. The frontier was a place where such unusual situations could arise, and where individuals had the freedom, or perhaps the necessity, to respond according to their own judgment rather than waiting for institutional guidance. The story of the outlaw who saved the marshal's life became legendary precisely because it captured something essential about frontier values: the importance of courage, the obligations created by life-saving interventions, the respect for worthy opponents, and the recognition that human character is more complex than simple labels of law-abiding or criminal would suggest. In the days following the ambush, as Carter and Malone began working together to address the larger threat that the Bridger gang represented, they would face additional challenges that would test their unlikely alliance and further reveal their characters. But the foundation of their partnership, and the beginning of the legend they would create, was established in those few violent minutes in Devil's Canyon, when an outlaw made a choice that defied logic, and a marshal accepted help from an unexpected source. In the days following the ambush at Devil's Canyon, Marshal Elias Carter and Jack Silver Malone found themselves navigating unfamiliar territory, not merely the physical landscape of the western frontier, but the complex social and moral terrain of an alliance that defied conventional boundaries. Their partnership, born of necessity and sealed with a handshake, would be tested repeatedly as they pursued their common goal of confronting the Bridger gang. This chapter examines the period from mid-March through early April 1877, when these two men traveled together through some of the most challenging country in the territory. We will explore how they managed the practical difficulties of their cooperation, how their relationship evolved through shared experiences, and how their partnership reflected broader themes of frontier justice and survival. Historical documentation of this period comes from multiple sources. Carter's official reports, though necessarily incomplete given the sensitive nature of his alliance with a wanted outlaw, newspaper accounts based on witness testimony, later interviews with both men, and the recollections of individuals who encountered them during their travels. These sources provide a detailed picture of a remarkable partnership that would become central to the legend that followed. The immediate aftermath of the Devil's Canyon ambush required Carter and Malone to make practical decisions about how they would proceed. Carter's horse had been lost in the ambush, leaving him without transportation in remote territory. Malone had his own horse, but only one, creating an immediate logistical challenge. Their first decision was to travel together to the nearest settlement where Carter could obtain another horse. This required Malone to accompany Carter into a town where the outlaw might be recognized, creating obvious risks. However, Malone agreed to this plan, demonstrating his commitment to their temporary alliance. According to contemporary accounts, he took reasonable precautions to avoid drawing attention, but did not attempt to hide his identity completely. The journey to the town of Cottonwood Creek, approximately 15 miles from Devil's Canyon, gave the two men their first extended opportunity to talk beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together. Several sources describe conversations during this journey, in which they discussed their backgrounds, their perspectives on law and criminality, and their views on the Bridger gang. Carter learned that Malone's antagonism toward the Bridger gang was not merely professional rivalry, but based on genuine objections to their methods. Malone described incidents where the gang had intimidated ordinary settlers and had conducted operations that he viewed as dishonorable. While Malone acknowledged his own criminal activities, he made clear distinctions between what he considered acceptable outlaw behavior and the more ruthless tactics employed by groups like the Bridger gang. For his part, Carter shared his perspective on law enforcement and his belief that stable communities required reliable justice. He did not attempt to defend all aspects of frontier law enforcement, acknowledging that some lawmen abused their authority. However, he explained his view that without consistent application of law, communities would remain vulnerable to whoever had the most force and the least scruples. These conversations, according to multiple accounts, were respectful but direct. Neither man attempted to convert the other to his worldview, but both sought to understand the other's perspective. This mutual respect for intellectual honesty, even across fundamental disagreements, helped establish the foundation for their working relationship. The arrival of Marshal Carter and Jack Malone in Cottonwood Creek together created immediate interest and speculation among the town's residents. The sight of a known federal marshal traveling in the company of a wanted outlaw was unusual enough to generate considerable discussion. Carter addressed the situation directly by meeting with the local sheriff and explaining in general terms that he and Malone had formed a temporary alliance to address a common threat. He did not provide extensive details, but made clear that he took responsibility for the arrangement and that it was sanctioned by his authority as a federal marshal. This official explanation helped reduce immediate tensions, though it did not eliminate skepticism. The sheriff of Cottonwood Creek, a man named Samuel Wright, had a reputation for practical judgment rather than rigid adherence to procedure. According to his later account, he recognized that Carter was placing his own reputation at risk by this alliance and concluded that the marshal must have compelling reasons. Wright agreed to accept Carter's arrangement, though he made clear that if Malone committed any criminal acts within his jurisdiction, he would have to respond accordingly. Malone, for his part, conducted himself carefully during their time in Cottonwood Creek. He remained with Carter throughout their stay, avoiding situations where his presence might create problems. He paid for his lodging and supplies with legally obtained currency, making no attempt to profit from the situation. His behavior suggested a man who understood that he was operating under unusual circumstances and had no desire to abuse the temporary protection his alliance with Carter provided. The town's residents had mixed reactions to Malone's presence. Some were uneasy about having a known outlaw walking freely through their community. Others were intrigued by the unusual situation and sought opportunities to observe or even speak with him. A few expressed support for the alliance, viewing it as a pragmatic response to the genuine threat that the Bridger gang represented. During their 2 days in Cottonwood Creek, Carter obtained a new horse and supplies for the pursuit of the Bridger gang. He also gathered additional information about the gang's recent activities and possible locations. Several citizens provided information they had previously been reluctant to share, apparently encouraged by the fact that Carter now had an ally with skills that might be useful in confronting the gang. With transportation secured and intelligence gathered, Carter and Malone began planning their pursuit of the Bridger gang in earnest. This required combining Carter's methodical investigative approach with Malone's knowledge of how outlaws operated and where they might seek refuge. The intelligence Carter had gathered suggested that the Bridger gang was operating from a base somewhere in the Eagle Ridge area, a mountainous region with difficult terrain and limited access routes. The area was known for numerous canyons, hidden valleys, and natural defensive positions that would make locating and approaching the gang extremely challenging. Malone's contribution to the planning was significant. His experience operating outside the law gave him insight into where and how a gang might establish a hideout. He understood the requirements for such a location: access to water, defensive advantages, escape routes, and proximity to supply sources. He could anticipate how the gang would respond to pursuit and what tactics they might employ. Together, Carter and Malone developed a strategy that differed from typical law enforcement approaches of the era. Rather than attempting to gather a large posse and conduct a direct assault, which would likely warn the gang and allow them to escape, they planned to locate the gang's base through careful reconnaissance. Once they knew the exact location and strength of their opponents, they could decide whether to attempt apprehension themselves or return with additional forces. This strategy reflected a practical assessment of their situation. A posse large enough to overwhelm the Bridger gang would be difficult to organize and would attract attention that would alert their quarry. Carter and Malone traveling together, however, could pass as ordinary travelers or even as outlaws themselves, allowing them to gather intelligence without raising alarm. The plan also acknowledged the reality that Carter's official authority was limited in how it could be applied when working with an outlaw partner. Any direct confrontation with the Bridger gang would raise legal and procedural questions about Malone's role and status. By focusing initially on intelligence gathering, they could defer these complications while working toward their immediate goal of locating and assessing the threat. The Eagle Ridge region presented formidable challenges to anyone attempting to navigate it. The terrain was rugged, with steep slopes, dense vegetation in some areas, and bare rock in others, and weather that could change rapidly. The routes through the mountains were few and often treacherous, requiring careful navigation and constant attention to potential hazards. For Carter and Malone, the physical challenges of the terrain were compounded by the knowledge that they were entering territory where the Bridger gang likely had advantages of familiarity and possibly advanced warning systems. Every canyon could conceal an ambush, every ridge could hide lookouts, and every settlement they approached might include informants loyal to the gang. The two men adopted practices designed to minimize their vulnerability. They avoided the most obvious routes, choosing more difficult paths that were less likely to be watched. They maintained careful observation of their surroundings, watching for signs of human presence or surveillance. They established signals for communication, when separated and agreed on procedures for responding to various types of threats. These precautions reflected the reality that they were operating deep in hostile territory, with no backup available. If they were discovered and attacked by the full Bridger gang, they would have to rely entirely on their own skills and resources. This shared vulnerability created a bond between them, as each man's survival depended significantly on the competence and vigilance of the other. During their travels through the mountains, several incidents occurred that tested and strengthened their partnership. On one occasion, they encountered a group of prospectors who eyed them suspiciously and asked pointed questions about their business. Carter's presence and authority as a marshal helped defuse the situation, while Malone's demeanor convinced the prospectors that they were not a threat. The complementary nature of their capabilities, Carter's official authority and Malone's frontier credibility, proved valuable in navigating such encounters. On another occasion, while crossing a particularly treacherous section of trail, Malone's horse lost its footing on loose rock. Carter immediately responded, helping to stabilize the horse and prevent what could have been a serious fall. This quick assistance, requiring no discussion or hesitation, demonstrated that the two men had developed an instinctive coordination that went beyond their formal agreement. As Carter and Malone penetrated deeper into Eagle Ridge territory, they began gathering intelligence about the Bridger gang's activities and location. This required a combination of techniques: observing signs of human activity, questioning individuals they encountered, and piecing together patterns from fragmentary information. Malone's skills proved particularly valuable in this aspect of their mission. His experience taught him to read subtle signs that might escape notice: disturbed vegetation indicating recent passage, the quality of smoke from distant fires suggesting the size of camps, and the behavior of local wildlife that might indicate human presence nearby. He could often determine from examining a campsite how many people had been there, how recently, and even sometimes whether they had been relaxed or alert. Carter contributed his systematic approach to investigation, maintaining careful records of what they observed, and methodically analyzing patterns in the information they gathered. He interviewed individuals they encountered with practiced skill, asking questions that yielded useful information without revealing too much about his own purposes. His official status as a marshal sometimes encouraged cooperation from individuals who might have been reluctant to speak with someone else. Through several days of careful work, they gradually developed a clearer picture of the Bridger gang's operations. The gang appeared to be based in a valley known locally as Silver Fork, a remote location accessible through only two main approaches, both of which could be easily watched and defended. The gang's numbers were estimated at 12 to 15 men, consistent with previous intelligence. They appeared to be planning additional criminal activities, though the specific targets remained unclear. The intelligence gathering also revealed information about the gang's relationships with local communities. Some settlers were clearly intimidated by the gang and provided assistance unwillingly. Others appeared to have more cooperative relationships, possibly profiting from the gang's activities or sharing the gang's resentment toward mining companies and other corporate interests. This complex web of relationships would need to be considered in any plan to confront the gang. The long hours of travel and the enforced proximity of their partnership gave Carter and Malone numerous opportunities for conversation. These discussions, described in various historical sources, covered topics ranging from practical matters to philosophical questions about law, justice, and the nature of frontier society. One recurring topic was the question of what circumstances might lead a man to operate outside the law. Carter expressed his view that while poverty and lack of opportunity contributed to criminality, individuals still bore responsibility for their choices. Malone countered that the legal system often protected the interests of the powerful while providing little justice for ordinary people, making alternative approaches to survival and prosperity understandable, if not justifiable. Neither man convinced the other to change his fundamental position, but both gained appreciation for the complexity of the issues. Carter acknowledged that not all laws were just, and that enforcement could be selective or biased. Malone acknowledged that without some system of law, communities would be at the mercy of whoever could impose their will through force. They also discussed their personal histories and the choices that had led them to their current positions. Carter spoke about his military service and how witnessing the chaos and suffering of war had convinced him of the importance of stable institutions and reliable justice. Malone described experiences that had taught him distrust of authority and had led him to rely on his own skills and judgment, rather than on social institutions he viewed as unreliable or corrupt. These conversations revealed common ground, despite their different paths. Both men valued courage, competence, and integrity. Both had codes of conduct they tried to observe, though those codes led them to different conclusions about appropriate behavior. Both had experienced loss and hardship that had shaped their worldviews, and both had reputations they sought to maintain, understanding that in frontier society, a man's reputation was among his most valuable possessions. Despite their growing mutual respect, the alliance between Carter and Malone was not without tensions and challenges. The fundamental opposition between their roles, lawman and outlaw, created situations where their interests and obligations diverged. One significant moment of tension occurred when they encountered a small-time cattle rustler that Carter recognized from wanted notices. The rustler posed no threat to their mission against the Bridger gang, but Carter's duty as a marshal required him to enforce the law when he encountered criminal activity. Malone argued that pursuing this individual would delay their main objective and might alert the Bridger gang to their presence in the area. After discussion, Carter agreed to note the rustler's location and returned to address the matter after their primary mission was complete. This compromise satisfied neither man's preference, but represented a practical accommodation to their unusual circumstances. The incident highlighted the ongoing challenge of reconciling Carter's official obligations with the requirements of his temporary alliance with Malone. Another source of tension emerged from their different approaches to risk and confrontation. Carter's training and experience emphasized careful planning and minimizing unnecessary danger. Malone, while not reckless, was more accustomed to accepting high-risk situations as normal aspects of his profession. These different risk tolerances sometimes led to disagreements about tactics and timing. Perhaps most significantly, both men were aware that their alliance was temporary, and that once their immediate objective was achieved, they would return to their normal adversarial relationship. This awareness created an underlying tension in their interactions, a recognition that they were building trust and even friendship with someone who would eventually become an opponent again. Despite these tensions, the alliance held. Both men demonstrated consistent commitment to their agreement, and both showed willingness to compromise when their preferences conflicted. The strength of the partnership lay not in the absence of disagreements, but in their ability to manage those disagreements constructively while maintaining focus on their common purpose. During their travels through Eagle Ridge territory, Carter and Malone passed through several small settlements and encountered various frontier residents. These interactions provided insight into how frontier communities viewed their unusual alliance and how such communities functioned more broadly. In one small mining camp, they met a family that had recently arrived seeking their fortune, but had quickly discovered the harsh realities of frontier life. The family had been subjected to intimidation by the Bridger gang, which demanded payment for protection and made clear that refusal would have serious consequences. The father, a man named Thomas Henderson, was caught between fear of the gang and his desire to provide for his family without submitting to extortion. Carter and Malone spent an evening with the Henderson family, and the conversation that occurred illustrated the different perspectives they brought to frontier challenges. Carter offered reassurance that law enforcement was working to address the Bridger gang threat and that proper legal channels existed for resolving such situations. Malone, more cynically, pointed out that legal processes were slow and uncertain, and that families in immediate danger sometimes needed more immediate solutions. Yet both men agreed on one crucial point: families like the Hendersons deserved to live without fear of criminal intimidation. This shared conviction, despite their different views on law and justice, reinforced their common purpose in confronting the Bridger gang. The Henderson family's situation personalized what might otherwise have been an abstract law enforcement operation, reminding both Carter and Malone that real people were affected by the criminal activity they were working to stop. In another settlement, they encountered a merchant who had achieved a kind of accommodation with the Bridger gang, providing supplies in exchange for being left alone. The merchant, whose name was Jacob Sterling, represented a common frontier dilemma: how to survive when legal protection was uncertain and refusal to cooperate with dangerous men could be fatal. Sterling's situation generated discussion between Carter and Malone about the nature of complicity and the extent to which people could be held responsible for cooperation with criminals when that cooperation was effectively coerced. Carter maintained that such cooperation, while understandable, helped sustain criminal operations and delayed the establishment of proper order. Malone countered that judging people for trying to survive in difficult circumstances was unfair when those doing the judging were not facing the same dangers. After nearly 2 weeks of careful investigation and reconnaissance, Carter and Malone located what appeared to be the Bridger Gang's main base of operations. The discovery came through a combination of patient intelligence gathering and skillful tracking that brought together both men's capabilities. The base was indeed in the Silver Fork Valley, a location that provided natural defensive advantages while remaining accessible to the routes the gang used for their criminal activities. From a concealed observation position on a ridge overlooking the valley, Carter and Malone spent several days watching the site, counting the number of gang members present, noting their routines and patterns, and assessing the challenges that any attempt to apprehend them would present. The intelligence they gathered confirmed that the gang numbered approximately 15 men and was well armed and organized. The site included structures that suggested semi-permanent occupation, indicating that the gang intended to continue operating from this location for some time. Lookouts were posted on the approaches to the valley, making surprise approach difficult. The terrain meant that any direct assault would require attacking uphill against defended positions, a tactical nightmare for any assault force. Carter and Malone discussed their options extensively. A direct attack by just the two of them would be suicide against such numbers and defensive advantages. Returning to gather a large posse would take time and might allow the gang to escape if they received warning. Federal military forces could potentially be requested, but such requests took weeks or months to process and were granted only for the most serious situations. The solution they developed reflected creative tactical thinking born from their combined experience. Rather than attempting a direct assault, they would work to divide the gang and deal with smaller groups separately. Intelligence suggested that gang members regularly left the main base for various purposes, gathering supplies, conducting reconnaissance, and carrying out criminal operations. By targeting these smaller groups, Carter and Malone might gradually reduce the gang's strength while gathering additional evidence of criminal activity. This strategy was risky and would take time, but it offered possibilities that a direct confrontation did not. It would allow them to work within Carter's legal authority while utilizing Malone's skills and knowledge. Most importantly, it might succeed where conventional approaches would fail. As March gave way to April, the alliance between Marshal Elias Carter and Jack Silver Malone had evolved from an emergency expedient into a functioning partnership. The two men had traveled together through dangerous territory, faced threats and challenges cooperatively, and developed a relationship that transcended their official positions as lawman and outlaw. The partnership worked because both men brought essential capabilities that complemented each other. Carter contributed official authority, systematic investigation methods, and a deep commitment to justice. Malone contributed frontier skills, understanding of criminal operations, and tactical competence. Together, they formed a more capable team than either could have been alone. Perhaps more significantly, they had developed mutual respect based on demonstrated character. Carter had seen that Malone, despite being an outlaw, operated according to principles and could be trusted to honor his commitments. Malone had seen that Carter, despite being a federal marshal, was fair-minded and willing to recognize that frontier justice sometimes required flexibility. Their journey through Eagle Ridge territory had also revealed the complex nature of frontier society. Communities caught between the desire for law and order and the practical reality of limited legal protection, individuals forced to make difficult choices about cooperation with criminals or resistance that might have fatal consequences, and the ongoing tension between corporate interests and local populations. The discovery of the Bridger Gang's base represented a turning point in their mission. They now knew where their enemy was located and had developed a strategy for confronting them. The execution of that strategy would test their partnership further and would ultimately determine whether their unlikely alliance could achieve its objective. The legend that was beginning to form around Carter and Malone reflected something important about frontier values. Their cooperation demonstrated that courage, honor, and practical necessity could sometimes transcend legal boundaries, that enemies could recognize common purposes, and that the complexity of human character resisted simple categorization. As they prepared to move from reconnaissance to action, both men understood that the most dangerous phase of their mission lay ahead. They would need all their combined skills, courage, and tactical intelligence to succeed against a well-armed and entrenched enemy. But they also knew that they had formed a partnership capable of attempting what neither could accomplish alone, bringing a dangerous criminal gang to justice and making frontier communities safer for ordinary people trying to build their lives. Over the following weeks, Marshal Carter and Jack Malone executed their strategy with precision. They intercepted smaller groups of the Bridger gang members, gradually weakening the organization. Carter made arrests where possible, while Malone's presence discouraged resistance. By late April 1877, the gang had been effectively dismantled, with Thomas Bridger and his remaining men either captured or forced to flee the territory. The success of their mission created a dilemma both men had anticipated. Their alliance had achieved its purpose, and the time had come to honor the remainder of their agreement, to part ways and return to their respective roles. In early May, on a trail outside Silver Creek, they had their final conversation as partners. According to later accounts, Carter acknowledged that he would resume his duty to enforce the law, which meant pursuing Malone if their paths crossed again. Malone accepted this, expressing no resentment about the return to their natural opposition. They shook hands one final time, and Malone rode off toward the horizon while Carter turned back toward civilization. News of their unlikely partnership spread rapidly through newspapers and word of mouth. The story captured public imagination, a federal marshal and a wanted outlaw joining forces against a common enemy, demonstrating honor and courage despite their opposing positions. For Marshal Carter, the alliance brought both praise and criticism. Some applauded his pragmatic approach and successful outcome. Others questioned whether he had compromised his duty. Carter defended his actions in official reports, arguing that extraordinary circumstances required flexible responses, while maintaining that he had never abandoned his commitment to law and justice. Jack Malone's fate after their parting remains somewhat mysterious. Some accounts suggest he eventually left the outlaw life, perhaps influenced by his experience working alongside the law rather than against it. Other sources claim he continued his criminal career but maintained the principles he had demonstrated during his alliance with Carter. Historical records show no confirmed encounters between the two men after their parting, though rumors and unverified stories suggested they may have crossed paths again. The story of Carter and Malone became a staple of frontier folklore, retold and embellished over generations. It represented several themes that resonated deeply with American audiences: the possibility of redemption, the complexity of moral character, respect between honorable opponents, and the idea that shared purpose could transcend social divisions. The legend reflected frontier values emphasizing individual character over social position. It suggested that honor, courage, and integrity mattered more than labels of lawman or outlaw. This aligned with American ideals about individual worth and the possibility of moral growth regardless of past actions. Historians continue to debate the exact details of the Carter-Malone partnership, separating documented facts from legendary embellishments. What remains clear is that two men from opposite sides of frontier society formed a genuine alliance, achieved a significant objective together, and created a story that continues to fascinate over a century later. The partnership between Marshal Elias Carter and Jack Silver Malone demonstrates that frontier history was more nuanced than simple narratives of good versus evil suggest. Their story reminds us that human character is complex, that circumstances can create unexpected alliances, and that honor and courage can exist in unlikely places. Their legend endures because it speaks to timeless human experiences, the recognition of worth in unexpected people, the bonds formed through shared danger, and the possibility that even enemies can find common ground when facing greater threats together. The outlaw who saved the marshal's life became more than a historical incident. It became a symbol of frontier values, American ideals about redemption and character, and the enduring belief that individuals can transcend their circumstances through courage and honor.